Hey Bio! Today is Wednesday, April 22nd, and we are getting started on a new module. We are starting module 12, which covers phylum Arthropoda. All right, and so just a couple housekeeping things before we dive into the slides. Like all previous modules, you do need to complete a vocab component for this module. There are 12 terms, and I have added those to the Quizlet classroom, and they say Apologia Biology, Module 12. So like the last module, make sure that you're in the Quizlet classroom, that you've studied those, and when you are ready, you may go on and complete the test section one time like you did for the previous module, and I will give you credit when I see that you have completed that. And that will kind of serve as our vocabulary for this module. And like I said, only 12 terms, so pretty small in terms of some of the previous modules, which have had a lot more than 12 words to learn. So we are now talking about phylum Arthropoda, and as we learned previously, invertebrates make up the majority of the animal kingdom, and the most populous phylum of invertebrates is in fact the arthropods. And so if you know anything about arthropods, then you know that arthropods are things such as lobsters, crayfish, spiders, scorpions, and insects. All of those fall under this phylum. And so we're going to start off our discussion talking about the common characteristics of all arthropods. So while there's differences amongst, a spider versus a scorpion versus a lobster, they do share 5 distinguishing characteristics that allow us to classify them as arthropods. All right, so the first distinguishing characteristic is that they have an exoskeleton. And all arthropods have an exoskeleton, which is a body covering typically made of chitin that provides support and protection. This chitin material is both flexible and tough, and it's typically made of a mineral type substance that makes it hard and provides that protection and support to the fleshy bodies of a arthropod. So if you've ever ate a lobster or a crab, for instance, you know that they have that hard shell that you have to crack open and break to get to the fleshy part that we consume for food. And so that is their exoskeleton that you're breaking. It's often very heavy and it limits their growth potential because the size of the exoskeleton has to be increased as the size of the arthropod is. And so it's basically they have to molt or shed, as we're going to talk about, as their fleshy body part grows. They have to eventually come out of that exoskeleton, and that has to be upgraded to a bigger size. Eventually, it will be too heavy for the arthropod to carry around. Because of this factor, it makes growth during the life cycle very challenging for an arthropod. What happens is that the exoskeleton is secreted from the epidermis of the arthropod, and it forms around the body, but since it cannot grow, it gets to be very constricting on these creatures. And so the arthropod has to molt several times throughout its lifetime, which is just simply the shedding of that old outer covering that's replaced with a new outer covering. When I was little, I used to have hermit crabs that would go through this type of process, and they looked really weird when they were molting because they were out of their shell and they were all funky, and they had to find a bigger shell to go into that fit them. So you always had to provide them with different size shells so they could find one that was the right fit for their new and bigger body. To do this, in order to molt, arthropods have to secrete enzymes that essentially weaken the current exoskeleton that they have. Then they take in water, which causes them to swell until that exoskeleton breaks apart, and a new one will get produced under the old one. The new one is obviously larger than the old one due to the fact of the swelling from the water, which then allows that arthropod room to grow into its new exoskeleton. The second defining characteristic of arthropods is that they have body segmentation. So arthropods are segmented, and they are divided into 3 major divisions, that being the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. So the head is fairly self-explanatory. The thorax would be the body region between the head and the abdomen. And the abdomen, of course, is the body region posterior to the thorax. Sometimes, and depending on the creature that we're talking about here, these divisions can actually be further segmented. For example, some arthropods have a thorax and a head united into a single segment. And in that case, we would say that's a cephalothorax, which is, as I said, a body region composed of the head and thorax fused together. And what segmentation does is it allows the exoskeleton to shift with its body movements. The third defining characteristic of an arthropod is that it has jointed appendages, and these appendages allow it to bend. Muscles form under that hard exoskeleton material, and it forms a joint, a movable joint underneath. So again, if you've ever ate lobster and boiled them and had them for dinner, you know that you can take the lobster and you can bend the tail and move it. So that's what we're talking about here when we say movable appendages and joints. And same with the little legs and appendages on it. They bend and move underneath the exoskeleton. The fourth defining characteristic is that it has a ventral nervous system. So arthropods have a ventral nervous system, and this allows them to react to stimuli like seeking prey and also responding and protecting themselves against predators. They have a fairly complex brain. It's formed of 2 ganglia, as well as a ventral nerve cord that runs from the ganglia to the posterior of their body. The placement at the ventral portion of the body provides max protection. So when we say ventral, that's the underside or the lower part of their body. Remember, dorsal, we said, is the term that's used for the top part of an animal, like a dorsal fin on a dolphin. So when we say that they have a ventral nerve cord, it's running down the ventral side or the underside, which allows it to be protected by the exoskeleton and the bulk of their fleshy body. And so if you ever pick up, like, say, a lobster or a crayfish or something, for example, that's alive, they actually do a lot to try to protect that underside, because that's where their nervous system lies, and that's where they're able to form complex things, and so they know that that's a vital area that needs to be protected. Okay? And so continuing on about this ventral nervous system, the arthropod is fed information via various sensory organs. So, for example, the antenna in the head region provide senses like touch, taste, and smell. And also eyes form a sensory organ for these creatures as well. And you can have 2 types of eyes. You can have a compound eye, which is an eye made up of many lenses, each with a very limited scope. Or you can just have a simple eye, which is an eye with only 1 lens. Both of these types of eyes detect light, turn light energy into electrical signals, and send signals to the brain or the ganglia, and convert that into an image. Don't be mistaken here when we say a simple eye. There is really nothing simple about a simple eye. It's not necessarily less desirable than a compound eye in this case. It still forms a very complex structure to allow the species of arthropods to see. Okay, and so this is the picture from your book, but this is just showing you on a spider the differences between the eyes. Okay, so these are simple eyes here, and this is a compound eye. You see many different lenses. This is of a fruit fly. The 5th and final feature of the arthropods that allows us to classify them as such is that they have an open circulatory system. So the heart is in the dorsal or upper region of their body, and it pumps blood into short vessels. These vessels empty out into different body cavities in the arthropod, and blood flows right over all of the cells in the cavity. So it's essentially always bleeding eternally. Okay? And so an open circulatory system, you can define it more officially as a circulatory system that allows the blood to flow out of the blood vessels and into various body cavities so that the cells become in direct contact with the blood. In opposition to this, humans, like ourselves, have a closed circulatory system in which all of our blood is carried in blood vessels like arteries and veins. We do not bleed internally per se. It is all enclosed in a blood vessel, hence why we have a closed circulatory system. Okay? And that's the last slide we're going to do for today. I have one video resource that I would like you to watch at the end of this video. So make sure you check that out after. And we are just going to end with a quick fact check on what we've covered up to this point on the characteristics of all arthropods. So number 1 says, suppose an arthropod lives in an ecosystem which contains no predators. The arthropod would never ever be threatened. Would it need an exoskeleton in this situation? The answer is yes, it would still need an exoskeleton because its fleshy body still requires that support. So even though there may not be any predators, its body would not be able to handle itself without the protective covering of that chitin exoskeleton. Number 2 says, if you count the cephalothorax as one body segment, how many major segments does an arthropod with a cephalothorax have? The answer would be 2. Instead of 3 body segments, we've combined the cephalothorax into one, so only 2 body segments. Number 3 is, an organism moves its joints with muscles that lie on top of the joint. Is this organism an arthropod? The answer is no, it is not an arthropod because it's controlled from the bottom. Okay, so the organism's joints lie on top, but in an arthropod, they would be on the bottom underneath the exoskeleton. Number 4, if an arthropod cannot taste something, but the rest of the nervous system is operational, what sensory organ is malfunctioning? As we said, the antenna functions in things like taste and touch, and so in this case, its nervous system is still operational, but the antenna is busted or broken and it can no longer sense the taste of something. And number 5, finally, why do we say that arthropods are constantly bleeding internally? And that is because they have that open circulatory system, and blood is constantly leaving their arteries to flow directly into the tissues, and that is considered an open circulatory system, where you would be essentially bleeding internally versus keeping that into the vessels. Alright, so make sure you do check out that video resource, and I will see you again on Friday for your next video.